When an avalanche crashes down before your eyes, time stands still. Your breath catches in your throat, and in that moment, it becomes clear. Mountaineering isn't just about conquering peaks. It's about testing what you're willing to do for the person on the other end of the rope. Alaska speaks the language of the elements, and those who cannot hear it rarely return to tell their story. Among the icy giants of Denali National Park rises Mount Johnson, an 84-60-foot peak whose north face holds a route called Elevator Shaft, a narrow, nearly vertical snow and ice chute with a slope of up to 80 degrees and overhanging snow formations. It is a true test that only the most fearless climbers dare to attempt. April 1989 greeted the mountains of Alaska with capricious weather. Unexpected blizzards, followed by ghostly calm, created ideal conditions for avalanches. The temperature fluctuated from tolerable to deadly, and the wind, gathering strength on the open slopes, turned into an invisible enemy capable of pushing any climber into the abyss. Just a few weeks earlier, the Exxon Valdez oil spill had rocked Alaska, with 11 million gallons of oil spilling into Prince William Sound, dealing a devastating blow to a fragile ecosystem that many considered untouchable. Amidst the endless whiteness of the Alaskan mountains, two men were making their way toward their goal. For Jim Sweeney and Dave Neiman, climbing Mount Johnson was a symbolic gesture. If they could conquer this dangerous peak, then the environmental disaster caused by the oil spill could be overcome. But nature had other plans. And while carefree tourists shared stories in the mountain house hut, a new story was unfolding on the steep slopes of the icy giant, a story of how human will can clash with the merciless forces of nature. In the world of Alaskan mountaineering, Jim Sweeney stood out as a man for whom nothing was impossible. At 33, he was the embodiment of a daring, rebellious spirit. He had an impressive list of climbs under his belt, but it was his rebellious approach to the mountains, a mixture of tenacity and impulsiveness, that attracted like-minded people and caused concern among conservative climbers. In contrast to Jim, 31-year-old Dave Neiman was the epitome of methodical calm and confidence. His movements on the route were as precise as clockwork, and his decisions were well thought out, even in critical situations. If Jim was the flame of the expedition, Dave was its foundation, a man whose inner strength was evident, not in loud words, but in unwavering reliability. It was Dave who became Jim's mentor, spending thousands of hours climbing together, turning them from partners on a rope into brothers in spirit. In March 1989, as news of the Exxon Valdez environmental disaster filled the airwaves, they sat in a small bar in Talkeetna, silently watching television. The oil slick spreading across the waters of Prince William Sound filled them with anger, but also with determination. That evening, an idea was born. Their next climb would not be just a sporting achievement, but a symbolic act. Proof that the purity and grandeur of Alaska were stronger than corporate greed. Jim, his eyes fixed on the screen, compared the helplessness of the oil workers, who had been unable to stop the tanker or contain the spilled oil, to their own ability to keep each other on course, which was much more difficult than navigating a ship. Dave said nothing, but his gaze expressed complete agreement and determination. On April 14th, a taxi took them to the foot of Moose's Tooth. Setting up camp on the glacier, they prepared a minimal set of climbing equipment. The next day, the rocky section of the route proved unsuitable for climbing. The rock literally crumbled in their hands. Jim, shaking the fragments out of his glove, compared the rock to a sandcastle. Even his innate optimism could not find any arguments for continuing. The climbers decided to change their route, and instead of their original goal, they chose a route called Elevator Shaft on the north side of Mount Johnson. This route was a narrow, steep passage with almost vertical ice sections, no less challenging than what they had originally planned. At camp, Dave mapped out a new route, and after some thought, decided to leave the radio behind. The extra 700 grams seemed like unnecessary weight for such a difficult climb, where every gram counts. This decision, made to lighten the load, would prove fatal in the future. On April 17th, they set out on a reconnaissance mission under a heavy gray sky. During the ski traverse to Mount Johnson, they had to contend with stinging snow and strong winds. For a few minutes, the mountain disappeared completely in a blizzard, then suddenly reappeared. Dave carefully studied the future route through his binoculars, assessing the risk of avalanches and particularly dangerous snowdrifts above the slope. Recent snowfalls had significantly increased the avalanche risk, but he decided that the ascent was still possible if they set out early in the morning, before the sun had time to melt and destabilize the snow cover. That evening, they prepared for the climb, checking their equipment, assigning sections, and discussing a potential retreat plan. All around them stretched a world of glaciers and mountains, permeated by the strange calm that often precedes difficult trials. The morning of April 19th greeted them with clear skies and freezing temperatures, perfect conditions for climbing. Leaving their sleeping bags at the high camp 650 feet above the glacier, Jim and Dave began their ascent to the base of the elevator shaft at 5 a.m., hoping to complete the climb in a single day. They walked through the snow by the light of their headlamps until dawn. By 7:30 a.m., they reached the start of the route and stopped to wait for the first rays of sunlight. The entrance to the route, rocky and icy, required caution. Dave led the way on the initial section, securing the rope securely. The next two sections of the route were quick thanks to the solid ice, which provided good support. On the fourth section, Jim took the lead. The passage became narrower and steeper, up to 70 degrees, with alternating sections of ice and dense snow. But Sweeney moved confidently, clearly feeling in his element. Naaman carefully belayed his partner, securing himself with particular care. An ice screw to the side of a possible avalanche flow, a snow pick, and two deeply driven ice axes. Precautions that Jim usually joked about. At 32 feet above the station, Jim set up a picket, a steel rod to secure a foothold, then climbed another 50 feet. There, in front of him, was a snowy elevation, a potentially good place for the next picket. With his feet firmly planted, he took aim with his ice axe. The disaster struck without warning. When the ice axe broke through the snow crust, thousands of tons of snow came crashing down. In an instant, the confident climber was transformed from an active participant in the event to its victim. Dave instinctively pressed himself against the wall. His belay held the sudden jerk of the rope, and the avalanche passed within inches of him. When the flow subsided, he saw Jim lying 100 feet below. All he could see was his bloodied face sticking out from under the snow. After a moment of paralysis, Naaman gathered all his experience and determination. Methodically, but without hesitation, he began to prepare a rescue operation, securing the rope, calculating a safe descent, and mentally mapping out a plan of action. In those critical moments, Jim's fate depended entirely on his friend's composure and skill. Only Dave's abilities and his unwavering determination to save his comrade now stood between the injured climber and certain death. After the avalanche, a piercing silence reigned in the mountains, broken only by the metallic screech of the climber's crampons on the ice. Dave began a cautious descent toward his friend's motionless body, not even imagining that this was only the beginning of a 7-day struggle for survival that would test the limits of human capabilities and the power of friendship. When Jim Sweeney regained consciousness, he was initially disoriented. The world was blurry and sounds seemed muffled. Then a throbbing pain set in. His right thigh was burning, and he had a metallic taste of blood in his mouth. Dave's face, leaning over him, was the only constant in the chaos of sensations. His partner was already assessing the damage: a broken hip, probable dislocation. Bleeding from the nose and mouth indicated head trauma. The cracked helmet was a reminder of how close Jim had come to death, just inches from the sharp rock ledges. Through the veil of pain, Jim caught an unfamiliar expression in his friend's eyes. Fear. Not for himself, but for both of them. The situation was bordering on impossible. Seriously injured at an altitude of 5,500 feet, far from any routes, without communication, surrounded by avalanche-prone slopes. Naaman acted without hesitation. His first priority was to get Jim down to a safer place. It took 6 grueling hours to lower his immobile companion down the steep wall. Every inch required absolute concentration. One mistake could cost them both their lives. By evening, Dave had dug a deep snow trench in the slope to protect them from the wind and falling temperatures. He placed Jim inside, raised his legs, and wrapped him in a bivouac bag to prevent shock and hypothermia. In the pitch darkness, the climbers huddled together silently, without vows or loud words, only with the understanding that each was willing to do anything to save the other. The morning of April 20th revealed the seriousness of the situation. Jim was slipping into unconsciousness, and when he was conscious, he was delirious and did not always recognize Dave. With minimal food and fuel, it was impossible to stay where they were. Naaman made the difficult decision to leave his friend and go for help. The risk was enormous. Sweeney could die of cold or be buried by a new avalanche before rescuers returned. In a rare moment of clarity, Jim begged him not to leave him, but he understood the necessity of this step. Leaving instructions on how to use the stove and stay warm, Dave set off on the 12-mile journey across the crevasse-strewn Ruth Glacier. After a sleepless night and an exhausting descent, the crossing became a battle not only with nature, but also with his own exhausted body. In the snowy trench, Jim lost track of time. Pain and cold mingled with feverish delirium. In moments of clarity, he reflected on the irony. A man who had sought to help Alaska recover from an environmental disaster was now himself at the mercy of this harsh, natural environment. In a semi-delirious state, images flashed before his eyes. Oil-covered birds, sparkling ice, the faces of friends waiting for them. Sometimes he thought he could smell the ocean amid the endless snow. These visions led him to realize that Alaska was not just a place for climbing or environmental activism, but a living entity with its own conditions, sometimes generous, often ruthless. Meanwhile, Dave, having overcome the most dangerous section of the glacier, reached the mountain house hut. 6 hours of travel without rest had exhausted him to the limit. Stumbling through the door, he found himself in front of a group of surprised tourists. Among the skiers was a paramedic who immediately assessed the criticality of the situation. Without emergency evacuation, Jim's chances were rapidly dwindling with each passing hour. But the first blow awaited them immediately. The group had no radio communication. The only solution was to stamp a giant SOS in the snow. Dave begged the tourist to help him get back to his friend, but even the paramedic, who was willing to take the risk, admitted that without climbing equipment, climbing in avalanche-prone conditions was tantamount to suicide. The skiers set about creating a signal, while the exhausted Naaman stayed in the hut to regain his strength. The next day brought an unexpected turn of events. A small plane appeared over the glacier. Pilot Mark Nyberg and his pregnant wife Roberta, noticing the SOS, decided to land. The noble decision turned into a disaster. In poor visibility and thin air, the plane crashed. The pilot and his wife, who suffered a spinal injury, miraculously survived and made it to the hut. Now, not only the climbers were trapped, but also 7 strangers, including a pregnant woman. However, the accident had an unexpected advantage. Neighbor had an aviation radio. Due to the mountainous terrain, voice messages could not be transmitted, so the pilot developed a code of clicks. 1 meant yes, 2 meant no. Without waiting for the rescue operation to be completed, Dave, despite warnings of the suicidal risk, set off back to Jim. Every step was accompanied by the agonizing question: was his friend alive? When he reached the almost completely buried snow trench, Naaman found no sign of Jim. Panicked, he began digging through the snow and heard his friend's muffled voice. The emotions he had been holding back for hours burst forth, and Dave couldn't hold back his tears when he saw Sweeney's exhausted but alive face. The third and fourth days on the mountain turned into a battle with the elements. The blizzard that began on April 22nd grew into a full-scale storm, with hurricane-force winds that threatened to destroy their fragile shelter. Around midnight on April 23rd, they heard the low, growing roar of an avalanche, a sound that strikes primal fear in any climber. In the darkness, huddled together in the cramped snow cave, they could only wait, not knowing if their shelter would be in the path of the snow flow. In those moments of helplessness, both began to pray. Even Dave, usually rational and reserved, whispered words asking for one more day of life. Jim, overcoming his pain, joined him. Their quiet voices were drowned out by the roar of the falling snow. Morning found them alive, but in an even more desperate situation. The avalanche had passed within inches, partially burying their shelter. During their entire time on the mountain, they had eaten only a few spoonfuls of dry mix. Their wet clothes sucked the last of their warmth away. Jim insisted on descending to the glacier, where the chances of being spotted by rescuers were greater. Dave, assessing the risk of another avalanche, hesitated. Exhaustion heightened emotions, and an argument broke out between the friends. In the heat of the moment, Jim came up with an idea that surprised them both. He promised Dave a steak at the Double Muskie restaurant if he would get him down the mountain. This joke, told on the brink of death, diffused the tension. Dave smiled and specified the size, 36 ounces, he expected to receive for his efforts. This moment of humor was a turning point. Neiman realized that despite the risks, getting down was their only chance. The next 17 hours turned into hell. Dave methodically cleared a path, packing down the snow for Jim's safe descent, whom he was pulling in a bivouac bag. Every inch was an incredible effort. Jim, overcoming the pain, could only encourage his friend. It is noteworthy that even now, Sweeney returned to the topic of the Exxon Valdez, comparing their struggle to nature's fight against pollution. The environmental mission still meant something to him, even on the brink of death. When they were less than half a mile from the glacier, a new avalanche engulfed them both. In the chaos of the snow, they lost control and began sliding down, straight toward a 500-foot crevasse in the glacier. The fall seemed inevitable. At that moment, Jim, overcome by a strange mixture of despair and defiance, shouted into the void that he was ready to endure even more trials. That cry seemed to activate the last remnants of his will to live. Miraculously, they both found themselves on a narrow snow ledge, 30 feet from the edge of the crevasse. Having lost their last ice axe, they dug their hands into the snow, advancing inch by inch up the 70-degree slope. Once out of the crevasse, Jim, feeling euphoric at his rescue, suggested they continue their descent immediately. But Dave insisted on caution, knowing that the glacier was riddled with invisible crevasses. The contrast between Jim's emotional approach and Dave's practicality created a synergy that allowed them to survive where most would have given up. With each agonizing step toward the glacier, it became clearer that their strength lay not only in their endurance, but also in their complementary survival styles. After 7 days of struggle, exhausted to the limit, they reached the open space of the glacier. Reaching relatively safe territory marked the end of the second act of their ordeal. The final chapter of the drama was yet to come, and a brief clearing in the sky would play a key role, allowing rescue helicopters to spot the two men who had defied death and, for now, won the battle. By the seventh day, April 26th, Jim and Dave had reached the limits of exhaustion. Their bodies, ravaged by extreme temperatures and lack of food, were running on their last reserves. In a week, they had consumed only a few spoonfuls of food and melted snow. Their wet clothes had long since lost their ability to protect them from the cold, and the bivouac sack in which Dave was carrying his friend was torn to shreds by sharp ice protrusions. In the mountain house hut, Mark Nyberger leaned over an aviation radio. His pregnant wife, Roberta, lay next to him with an injured back. Using a simple click code, 1 click for yes, 2 clicks for no, the pilot transmitted their coordinates to a passing plane. It was a primitive but effective method of communication in conditions where the mountainous terrain blocked voice signals. In Takitni, the National Park Service coordinated a rescue operation with Chinook military helicopters, but thick clouds that had lingered for a week prevented them from approaching the presumed site of the disaster. At noon, something that could be called a miracle or a coincidence happened. The clouds over Mount Johnson suddenly dispersed, opening a brief window of opportunity. Sunlight, breaking through the veil for the first time in many days, illuminated 2 tiny figures against the white background of the glacier. Seeing the approaching plane, the climbers experienced a feeling that only those who have stood on the brink of life and death can understand. Jim, overcoming his pain, saw in this a symbol of their environmental mission. Just as the sun had broken through the clouds, so Alaska's natural environment would one day recover from the damage it had suffered. The plane circled several times, waving its wings to signal that they had been spotted. For Dave, who had been holding back his emotions all week, it was a moment of liberation. Tears of relief finally broke through as the weight of responsibility, hundreds of decisions, and physical exhaustion all came crashing down on him at once. Jim, true to form, humorously asked his friend to pull himself together. Real heroes shouldn't be caught by rescuers in a moment of weakness. Dave just waved it off, knowing that behind the joke lay deep gratitude. In the hut, Nyberg received confirmation that the search planes had spotted both the climbers and the group in the shelter. The Chinook helicopters waiting in Takitni immediately took to the air, and the skiers began preparing for evacuation. Soon, the silhouettes of military helicopters appeared in the sky. Their roar, usually annoying, now sounded like the most beautiful music. The pilots maneuvered skillfully between the peaks, demonstrating the skill necessary to work in the extreme conditions of Alaska. The rescue operation split into 2 directions. The first helicopter headed for Jim and Dave on the glacier, the second for the mountain house hut to pick up the other victims. Landing on the uneven surface of the glacier was risky due to snow dust reducing visibility, but the experienced crew managed it. Medics immediately began assessing the climber's condition. Jim's diagnosis was serious: a broken hip, possible hip dislocation, frostbite, exhaustion, and dehydration. Dave was in better condition, although he was suffering from extreme fatigue and early frostbite on his fingers. The doctors immobilized Sweeney's leg, set up intravenous hydration, and wrapped both men in thermal blankets. The warmth of the helicopter was such a stark contrast to the hell of the past week that reality seemed almost surreal. During the flight to Takitna, Jim, despite the painkillers, remained semi-conscious, his gaze shifting between his friend's face and the mountains floating below. These peaks, which had recently been their prison, now seemed strangely distant, as if from another world. A second helicopter evacuated the group from the hut, paying special attention to Roberta Nyberg, who was pregnant and had a back injury. The others were exhausted but in stable condition. In Takik, the survivors were met by representatives of the national park, medics, and journalists. The story of survival in extreme conditions had already attracted media attention, especially in the context of the Exxon Valdez environmental disaster. People who had fought for the purity of Alaska had themselves become victims of its merciless nature. After initial stabilization, the victims were taken to Providence Hospital in Anchorage. Jim was facing serious hip surgery, while Dave was discharged with a diagnosis of superficial frostbite on his finger and general exhaustion. When Jim's stretcher was unloaded on the hospital roof, he was greeted by friends, relatives, and members of Alaska's environmental community. For the latter, the climber's rescue was not only a personal joy, but also a symbolic victory in the context of the struggle to preserve the natural heritage. The story of the Mount Johnson climb transformed the lives of everyone involved. Jim Sweeney never regained full mobility in his hip after surgery and rehabilitation, but that did not break his spirit. A year later, he returned to the mountains, choosing less challenging routes. The main change for Sweeney was a rethinking of the role of mountaineers in protecting nature. He reflected on his experience in his book A Thousand Prayers, drawing parallels between his personal ordeal and the environmental challenges facing Alaska. The book was well received and became an important voice in the defense of the Arctic ecosystem. Dave Neiman was awarded the Carnegie Medal for heroism, but more important to him was his inner transformation. Faced with the limits of his endurance, he re-evaluated his priorities, and climbing gave way to family. Continuing to go to the mountains, he became more cautious and never forgot his radio. The climbers' friendship deepened into a special understanding accessible only to those who have looked death in the face together. They rarely spoke of the 7 days on the mountain, but their annual steak dinner at Double Muskie became a tradition, symbolizing not the date of their rescue, but the unbreakable bonds of human connection. Roberta Nyberg gave birth to a healthy baby boy 8 weeks after the accident. Mark's altruistic decision to land indirectly saved the climbers' lives. His radio signals helped rescuers locate the search area. The skiers returned to their normal lives, but their trampled SOS and attempt to help became part of rescue history, showing how survival depends on a chain of coincidences and good intentions. For the mountaineering community, the incident was a turning point. The National Park Service made communication devices mandatory for climbs in remote areas. Jim and Dave's story was included in mountaineering textbooks, reminding us that even professionals can underestimate the power of nature. The story had a profound impact on public consciousness. At a time when the Exxon Valdez oil spill raised questions about the balance between economics and ecology, the climbers' struggle became a metaphor for the battle to preserve nature. Their goal of drawing attention to the fragility of Alaska's ecosystem was achieved in an unexpected way. Today, Elevator Shaft attracts climbers, but they ascend with better equipment and mandatory communication devices. Jim and Dave's story reminds us that sometimes the greatest challenge is not reaching the summit, but returning from it with not only your life intact, but also your commitment to the values that brought you to the mountains. The story of Jim Sweeney and Dave Neiman makes us think about the very essence of human relationships. What would you do if you were in Dave's place? Would you leave your friend, knowing that this was his only chance, or would you stay and risk dying together? Or maybe you would never have taken such a risky route without a radio. It's interesting how the most important decisions in our lives are often made in a split second. One swing of an ice axe, one word said at the right moment, and your fate is changed forever. For Jim and Dave, it was a joke about steak that became the turning point between life and death. Have you ever been in a situation where humor saved you from panic? Or maybe there was someone in your life who was willing to risk everything for you? Share your stories in the comments. If you like this story, don't forget to like this video. It will help the algorithms promote it in recommendations. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next exciting stories about resilience, courage, and where the limits of human capabilities really lie. Take care, and see you in the next episodes.